Hi, this will be a film on the YouTube user, the Chopin method. Essentially, this is a person who portrays himself as being like a kind of mouthpiece for Chopin's ideas. Now, when I first saw these videos, my reaction was largely rather positive, actually. I think it's very important to understand what Chopin really thought, otherwise we can easily misunderstand the truth about his ideas. Now, probably most of us would understand that Chopin's big innovation was about the use of the arm. However, a lot of us might misunderstand that he was about these kind of really big, lavish arm movements, and that certainly wouldn't be true. Equally, we might misunderstand that he was a big proponent of arm weight technique, of using a kind of heaviness through the hand to send arm energy through the fingers. Again, not true. And I think it's very important we do understand accurately how he really thought about technique. So essentially, Chopin believed the fingers move the keys, and his big innovation was getting the arm to play a role while the fingers move the keys. Not instead of fingers moving the keys, not to weigh in on the fingers, but a kind of complementary role while the fingers move with precision. So the old school approach, finger isolation, might have looked something like this. In that one, like you've got a coin on your hand practically, you would hold the arm very still, barely move the arm at all. And that certainly wasn't Chopin's idea of technique. That's what he was reacting against, not playing that kind of role whatsoever himself. So a good example would be the first study from Opus 10, if I play a few bars of that. So there, but because of the size of these figurations, they span a 10th, 11th even, very wide intervals. The only way to successfully play that is to use a sideways arm motion, and while that's going on, the fingers take the keys. It's not heaviness of the arm bearing through the fingers, it's just the arm is creating an organisation while the fingers get on with moving the keys. And that's a very important thing to understand. It's incredibly valuable if we can appreciate how Chopin really saw these things. Now, on the other hand, what's being portrayed in these videos is basically no different to old-fashioned finger isolation. These lateral arm movements. He talks about them occasionally and shows videos saying the arm should move from side to side. And then he shows demonstrations saying it should look like this and does absolute zero lateral arm movement, which makes the whole thing, frankly, quite dangerous and completely misrepresentative of what makes the Chopin style of technique effective. So I'll show you, I'm going to demonstrate the movements as he shows them in some of his videos, when he was saying this is correct thumb movement, this is correct fifth finger movement. He says, don't do this, don't slump into it, completely agree. And then he says it should look like this. Now, I'll post links, check the real sources for yourself, don't take my word for it. Maybe I'm misrepresenting. So check his. But again, fifth finger if I show with my right hand. He says, don't do this, completely agree. And then he says, do this. Completely static in the arm. Literally no different from old-fashioned finger isolation. I mean, if I didn't know better while watching those videos, I'd think this guy doesn't represent Chopin's technique. I'd have thought this is a guy who advocates sticking a coin on your hand and making sure it doesn't fall off while you practice. Okay, so let's look in close up now. What we get a lot in these videos is the guys really heavily fixated on this Chopin exercise where we have the 3 black keys, 2 white keys on either side. And Chopin gives us this for the kind of reference hand position. Now, I think that a lot of that can be great, actually. I think it's a really good point of reference for certain. The problem is his demonstrations. Again, I'll give the links, check the real versions. Don't assume mine is necessarily representative, but make your own mind up. To me, they look like this. Particularly the animations, literally nothing moves apart from one finger at a time in the animations. No response in the arm. I'll link another one. There's one that looks more like this to me. Now, I'm exaggerating now. That is a kind of slightly exaggerated distortion. But again, check the link for yourself. See how his arm judders each time a finger goes down. Because he doesn't have any lateral motion going on, there's nothing to bind these movements together. And the problem is the concept of action and reaction. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. If we try to pretend otherwise, we can only do 2 things. Either we can lock the arm really stiff, that doesn't truly nullify that reaction, but we can get a fair simulation of it, as if the arm is made of steel. So we'll get a slight response still, but it's incredibly unsafe. It's not an effective way to do it. Or the other thing sometimes we might get these sort of judders. Because of our action, we get a response of a judder. If we don't want to do that, all we have to do is get these binding movements going on and go sideways. Simple as that. Get travelling, and then you're free. And again, I ask you, Chopin's big phrase that he was very keen on, apparently, souplesse avant tout, suppleness above all. Which of these is suppleness above all? That or that? To me, it couldn't be more clear cut. If you want to be supple, you have to be moving. I mean, literally the definition of suppleness essentially is having movement or movability. If something is completely immobile, it's not supple. So how can we build a Chopin method on these demonstrations which involve no suppleness? That's the one thing he says, suppleness above all, not suppleness occasionally, suppleness above all. If that's nowhere in these exercises, how can we say this is the Chopin method? This represents what Chopin would have wanted. Now, I suppose one thing I should add, by the way, I've occasionally seen students that play scales pretty well, but I get them to do their slow practice, and it looks like this. So clearly it's possible to do slow practice without really having any fluidity. And then when we move faster, I suppose we have to learn to move the arm better if we're going to have any chance of success. But does that mean it's good to practice like this? I never practice that way. If I'm doing my slow practice, I'll slow down the fluid motions, and then I know I'm practicing something that helps me get towards the fast stage. I feel it's a complete waste of time to do this kind of thing. So as I say, I know there are some pianists that can do slow practice that way and still get results. But I'd say those results come in spite of the slow practice, not because of it. So if there's any possibility that Chopin really did say, don't move your arm at all while you do these exercises, I don't believe that's the case. But if there did turn out to be evidence of that, I would still say that's just not a very effective way to practice. It becomes effective once we do this kind of thing. If we try to play the real version with that same premise, no movement at all, what's that going to look like? Something like this. Suddenly judders get there fast, now we're static again. And then suddenly judder, now we're static again. It's not grounded in any kind of functional reality. If we base our foundational movements on something that's not similar to the real version, how are we going to play musically? All we're going to do is spend all our time unlearning those problematic movements, which never gave us any useful foundations in the first place. So in one of the videos, we have a walking analogy, which is absolutely great. It's a really good parallel for playing well. The problem is what he shows us at the keyboard does not match his own premise. So let's break this down. When he keeps his arm incredibly static and pokes the fingers into the keys, this is a bit like if you've ever seen a step machine. If you imagine if you were to hold tightly onto the handles of a step machine and try and use the legs only to drive the pedals down, as if the upper body didn't even exist, it's just locked into place. That's a very close parallel to what he's actually doing. So anyway, if we take it to standing now, again, we can understand the concept of action and reaction through this. Basically, we have to receive reactions. We push our foot down, we have to receive what comes back. And the mass will accept that reaction, and it will mostly absorb it. But it has to respond. You can't cancel it. You just accept it, and then you get a natural response. That's how you can be free. So if you stand on one leg, take the leg in the air a little bit, your weight shifts over here. Now bring the other leg down, push it into the floor. Your action starts creating a reaction. You'll feel something coming up this leg. Gradually as that increases, you don't have to deliberately go across. Just by pushing that in and taking the other one away, you'll notice the mass of the upper body has to shift a bit more to find a balance upon that reaction from the leg. And now imagine if you decided, no, you're not going to respond to that. I'm only going to move my leg. What's that look like? Now, supposing I said to you, don't respond at all, but be relaxed. Is that helpful? Because it doesn't mean anything. The whole premise of not responding is based on not being relaxed. So we can't just say, do that, and oh yeah, and relax. It doesn't mean anything, I'm afraid. You have to have circumstances in which it's possible. Now, of course, the other thing, when walking, we go forwards. The equivalent to this in the piano is the lateral movements I spoke of. What we have in these demonstrations is along the lines of kind of stamp the foot down, stop, stamp the foot down, and stop. It looks more like this. If walking is our analogy, does this guy walk that way? Or does he walk like this? Smoothly and fluidly. using the reactions to elevate the mass, keep it supported. So, I mean, what Chopin gave us is very important. We don't want to use the mass to drive into the foot when we walk. We don't want to kind of slam down into the feet. We keep the mass elevated, and then the feet can push safely into the floor. The mass absorbs it. It's a really great parallel for how we play. But we have to do it accurately. If we have the kind of stop-start thing, that's not going to work. Okay, so let's link this basic exercise back to the action-reaction concept of walking. If we try to do nothing with the arm, basically we're just asking for trouble. We're going to get those juddering reactions coming up the arm. Maybe we try and fight them by bracing harder, pretending we can make them not happen. Not real. They always happen. We either accept them and let the mass of the arm absorb them, or we fight them and we're stiff. There's no relaxation where you hold still and relax at the same time. It's a completely contradictory premise. We've got to give the arm another roll. So the arm is moulding itself around the fingers as they take the keys. Now, I'm not going to pretend to be the voice of Chopin. I don't know for sure. Maybe there's some possibility he taught this briefly as an exercise with the arm static. I don't see that's credible though, personally. I'd say it's far more likely that given this is how we play a scale, Chopin said, move the arm sideways in a scale. Did he really teach this kind of thing as an exception to that? And only wait to then, okay, now let's get the arm moving. And then use good technique at the last moment. I can't say that definitely didn't happen, but there's no reason that I'm going to assume that's true. For me, much more likely that Chopin, who believed the arm should respond around the fingers. Fingers lead, arm responds. He believed the arm should move sideways while playing scales. We have all these contextual examples of music where the arm has to move sideways to be effective. Let's give another one actually, another Chopin study, where we get this kind of thing. Kind of virtual hand positions, absolutely huge, even bigger here than the Opus 10 number 1 study actually. So weightedness here, bearing the arm down on the fingers would be disastrous. That'd be absolutely horrible. But again, we can't do that kind of thing stopping on each one. The only way for this to be successful is to play within that steady lateral motion. That's what gives the freedom for the finger to stroke the key. Take that away, and again we're left with juddering motions. We have to keep this kind of stuff going. Now, maybe what I'm doing is more exaggerated than what Chopin did. Maybe it could be more condensed and reduced to the barest minimum. But what cannot be done is to reduce it too far and act like this. There's a minimum needed, and I'd rather do slightly too much than not enough. You can always condense later. If you start with fluidity, then you can think, okay, maybe that can be a bit less now, fine. If you start with this kind of juddering thing, you're not going to go anywhere very fast. So for me, I will always recommend, whether it be a basic scale or whether it be a basic 5-finger position, I will always recommend getting these guiding movements going. I'd much rather do a little bit too much of it and refine it later. Okay, so if I had to summarise what's going on in these videos, I think this guy started with good intentions, probably. And he reports a lot of very important information accurately. The problem is he's completely fixated on surface issues. He's not looking at the big picture, and he's not looking at suppleness above all, which is Chopin's motto. If you don't put that into the picture, you're not going to make any sense of what he was trying to do. And if you want to be a voice for Chopin, you've got to be held to a damned high standard. And he's not meeting those standards, I'm sorry. He's completely going against the things he's reporting with what he demonstrates. They do not match. So, I mean, if he just reported things simply without the demonstrations, I'd probably have nothing but praise for putting the information out there. But the only way to understand safe finger technique in Chopin's light is to appreciate the lateral arm motions that make it safe. If you keep giving these ridiculous demonstrations, just poking the fingers into the keys with a static arm, there's no safety in that. It's literally no different at all to old school finger isolation. And there's nothing good about teaching that kind of thing, especially not while claiming this is in the name of a composer who valued suppleness. Now, I think the problem is that what's happened, he's completely fixated on surface issues, which he reports accurately. I'll take his word for it on those, like the shape of the hand, all these kind of things. I think these can be quite beneficial. Where they cannot be beneficial is as a replacement for giving the arm its meaningful role in technique. If we're completely fixated on a particular shape, and the only thing we fixate on is that shape, we're missing the big picture. What makes it work is not the shape in isolation. If we use that shape and we get the arm travelling, we'll get plenty of benefits. If we use that shape and the arm is rigid or the arm judders, we're not going to get any of the benefits from it whatsoever. You can't fix the big picture if you get that wrong by fixating on surface issues. I don't believe Chopin would have done so. If he taught in person, I'm quite confident he would have seen when someone was doing juddering movements, suppleness above all. I'm sure he would have attended to that and stopped them concentrating on the surface. I'm sure that he would have shown them how to be supple and not continue to fixate on position as an end in itself. So that's the problem fundamentally. We're looking at this thing, he's making the video to prove a point. He's so caught up in one part of the hypotheticals that all he's doing is showing us that ludicrously exaggerated hypothetical outside of the context of how piano playing really works. Now, there may be a possibility that he's a very good pianist. Quite honestly, there's no way of telling from those demonstrations that he gives to us, because they're not fluid. They don't look very good at all, I'm afraid. So if he is a very good pianist, what he needs to do is start showing us some actual musical examples. Stop fixating on this one exercise just because Chopin did it. I don't think Chopin fixated on it in the way that this guy does. Yeah, he used it. But did Chopin make like hours of videos, or I mean up to an hour or so of videos, without getting into the sideways arm motions? I don't believe for a moment Chopin would have worked that way. I suspect most likely he included lateral motions in the exercise. If he didn't, I'm sure he moved on very quickly and concentrated on the fact you need the lateral motion of the scale, which we know that is what he taught. Scales are based on lateral arm motion. We haven't got to that yet in these videos. We're completely stuck on this thing of poking the fingers into the keys, making sure they have to be in a specific position. All surface stuff, completely stripped of the reality of how piano playing really works. So if this guy is a really good pianist, he needs to start showing us some movements in actual musical context. Start showing us motions that require the arm movements, and then we're going to get some useful stuff from him. But if he keeps going on and on with this stuff, just locking the arms still, poking the fingers, all he's going to do is completely mislead everyone about what Chopin worked from. It's not helpful, and I don't believe for a moment. I mean, it's not supple, it's not fluid, it doesn't look good. I don't believe this is Chopin that he's portraying at all. I'm sorry, but I'll be blunt. That what he's showing us is a sham. A lot of the information is good. The way he's assembling it into a product is a complete sham, I'm sorry.